Hey guys, tonight we step right into the noisy, fragrant chaos of medieval Paris, where walking the streets is a full contact sport. Except instead of dodging skateboarders or selfie stick wielders, you're dodging piles of dog poop, leaking chamber pots, and a swirl of smells that would make your modern day nose curl in protest. You probably won't survive this without stepping in something unpleasant at least once. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's tuning in from where as we wander these stinky streets together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a cobblestone street in the heart of Paris, the capital of medieval France. It's the late 1300s, the city buzzing with life, but also with other less pleasant substances. The air carries a pungent mix, the sharp tang of urine, the sourness of spoiled food, and a definite, undeniable whiff of dog poop. Everywhere you look, there are signs of life: merchants hawking wares, children darting between legs, and inevitably dogs of all sizes wandering freely, leaving their calling cards on the ground. Imagine the streets as a sort of obstacle course designed by the whims of animals and humans alike. With no modern sewage or sanitation system, the pavement beneath your feet isn't always what it seems. It's uneven, often slick with mud and muck, and scattered with the day's debris. Chamber pots, basically medieval pea buckets, get emptied onto the streets from upstairs windows, drenching the unsuspecting below with a sudden, warm shower of human waste. And of course, the ever present dog droppings are sprinkled generously along your path. Walking here isn't just a stroll, it's a full contact sport requiring vigilance and a strong stomach. One wrong step could send you skidding, or worse, smushing the evidence beneath your shoe, spreading the mess farther. The clatter of wooden carts and the chatter of market sellers form a lively soundtrack, but beneath it all lurks a persistent, unmistakable odor. This is medieval Paris, a city where smells are as loud as voices. You might be surprised to learn that this stench wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of crowded city life. It was a serious problem that affected health, commerce, and even politics. The streets of Paris were famously foul, and city officials worried enough to try to tackle the problem, though historians still argue whether their efforts truly made a difference or were more about appearances. Why so much dog poop? Well, Paris was home to thousands of dogs, from noble hunting hounds to scruffy alley curs and pampered lapdogs. These animals roamed freely, adding to the already chaotic mix of human and animal waste clogging the streets. And unlike today, where pet owners are expected to scoop after their pets, there were no handy plastic bags or designated poop bins. The mess was simply left to accumulate. This mess created a whole range of challenges. It made the streets slippery and unsanitary, discouraging merchants from setting up stalls and making travel unpleasant. The stench alone was enough to keep some people indoors on warmer days. Yet, amid the chaos, medieval Parisians developed fascinating and sometimes bizarre ways to cope. Over time, this growing nuisance gave birth to a curious new profession dedicated entirely to cleaning up after the city's four-legged residents. But more on that later. For now, imagine yourself trying to navigate these streets, eyes down, nostrils flaring, trying to avoid both the physical and olfactory traps that lay in wait. The city is alive, but so is the mess beneath your feet. And believe me, the smells you're inhaling are not some quaint background detail. They are central characters in this medieval drama. In fact, this was not just a Parisian issue. Many medieval cities struggled with waste management, but Paris, with its dense population and canine chaos, became notorious for its stink. And it's this unique confluence of people, dogs, and an utter lack of sanitation infrastructure that led to the creation of the earliest forms of urban waste management, poop collectors. But the story doesn't end with just a foul street scene. There's a human side to this, full of characters you wouldn't expect, wielding shovels and brooms to make the streets marginally better. And as you'll soon learn, the fight against dog poop was tangled up with social status, politics, and even economics. Before we move on, remember this vivid image: a busy Parisian street, muddy and cluttered, full of life and noise, with the smell of dog poop and human waste hanging thick in the air. This is where our story begins, a world both alien and strangely familiar. You press forward, eyes scanning the bustling sidewalks, where every corner seems to spawn more dogs. It's a veritable canine carnival. Hunting hounds strutting with nobles, scruffy alley curs scavenging scraps, and pampered lapdogs prancing like they own the place. Paris in the medieval era was dog city, and dogs were everywhere. Far from just pets, they served as companions, guards, hunters, and sometimes just street nuisances. Their sheer numbers turned the city into a sprawling, furry menace that left more than paw prints in its wake. By the late Middle Ages, Paris had exploded in population, reaching upwards of 200,000 residents. With so many humans crammed into narrow, winding streets, the dogs came along for the ride, literally and figuratively. These animals, beloved and despised in equal measure, were mostly free roaming. The city didn't have dog parks or fenced yards, just open streets and alleys. So naturally, their digestive outputs were just as free to roam too. Historians estimate there were tens of thousands of dogs in Paris at the time. Think of it, every street thrumming with the patter of paws, the barking chorus blending into the urban soundtrack. For many Parisians, dogs were part of daily life, some for practical uses like hunting or protection, others as symbols of wealth or companionship. But this abundance of dogs came with an unmistakable downside: a constant, ever growing pile of dog poop. Unlike today, where we might cringe but can quickly clean up after a pet, medieval Parisians had no such conveniences. Owners rarely, if ever, picked up after their dogs. The idea was almost unthinkable. After all, gloves were luxury items, and sanitation was mostly about trying not to die of disease rather than aesthetic cleanliness. The dogs did what dogs do, and the city simply endured the consequences. This canine population explosion turned dog waste into a daily crisis. Streets, alleys, and courtyards became littered with the stuff. It wasn't just an unpleasant nuisance, it was a real hazard. Slipping on dog poop was a common complaint, and the mess attracted flies and vermin, increasing the risk of disease. The smell could overpower entire neighborhoods, especially on hot summer days when the waste dried into dust and was kicked up by every passerby. Yet, dogs weren't the only contributors. Cats, pigs, chickens, and other animals also added their share of droppings, but none matched dogs in sheer volume or visibility. The dog poop problem was uniquely pervasive because of the animal size, numbers, and urban freedom. Now you might wonder, why didn't the city just ban dogs or control their population? Well, that's where things get complicated. Dogs were valued for many reasons beyond companionship. royal hunts, city guard duties, and pest control. Plus, medieval ideas about animals and their place in society were very different from ours. Killing off dogs wholesale wasn't a simple or popular solution. Instead, Paris tried a variety of measures to manage the problem, including laws aimed at dog owners and their animals. But enforcement was spotty, and cultural attitudes made compliance difficult. Dog owners ranged from wealthy nobles with prized hounds to poor street dwellers with mangy mutts. No single rule fit all. Interestingly, historians still argue whether the city's attempts to regulate dogs and their waste were effective or mostly performative. Some think the laws were more about giving the illusion of control than actually cleaning the streets. Others see them as early efforts in urban management that laid groundwork for future public health policies. You also get a sense that dogs themselves had social roles. Hunting dogs were prized and cared for meticulously. Lapdogs, often belonging to noble women, were treated like living fashion accessories. Meanwhile, street dogs survived by scavenging, often avoiding humans altogether. Their status influenced how much attention was paid to their mess, if any. This mix of canine classes and the sheer volume of dog droppings created a challenging urban ecosystem. It was a city where dogs could run free, poop freely, and Parisians had to live with the consequences. You might picture a medieval Paris where dogs were essentially poop machines on four legs, trailing a literal and figurative stench behind them. But these animals also brought companionship, utility, and even status, making the problem of their waste a delicate social and practical dilemma. As you navigate this world, remember the dog wasn't just a pet, it was a major player in the city's life and pollution problem. Understanding their role helps explain why poop became such a critical urban issue. So, next time you see a dog in your neighborhood, imagine the medieval Parisian's dilemma whether to cherish the creature, step gingerly around its latest deposit, or both. Your footsteps echo on the uneven cobblestones as you weave through the winding streets of medieval Paris, dodging more than just dogs now. You're watching out for the city's earliest attempts to wrestle with its growing poop problem, the first official laws. Yes, believe it or not, the city wasn't just resigned to living in filth. As early as the 13th century, authorities began issuing regulations aimed at cleaning the streets, particularly targeting the dog droppings that threatened to turn Paris into a giant, smelly minefield. These early laws were surprisingly strict, considering the era's overall tolerance for urban grime. In 1260, for instance, a city ordinance demanded that dog owners clean up after their pets or face penalties. The punishments ranged from fines to more embarrassing public humiliations, including being paraded around the city with a sign confessing their neglect. It's medieval social media, if you will. Public shaming was a favorite tool for enforcing civic norms. Imagine the walk of shame with a sign saying, I am a negligent dog owner, while everyone snickers or avoids you. Not exactly a TikTok challenge, but effective enough. However, enforcement was another story. Many Parisians ignored these decrees outright. It's one thing to pass a law, it's another to make sure it sticks, especially when gloves, buckets, and proper cleaning tools were in short supply. Historians still argue whether these regulations actually reduced the mess or merely created an illusion of control for visiting dignitaries and royal inspectors. One quirky detail: some laws required dog owners to tie a bell or a bell like device to their dogs so passers-by could hear them coming and avoid stepping in fresh deposits. is like a medieval poop alert system, except with a constant jingling soundtrack. The idea was part practical, part courtesy, and part desperation. In addition to dog poop, regulations targeted human waste disposal. Chamber pots, those infamous pee buckets, were supposed to be emptied only into designated cesspools or sewers, but the reality was messier. Many city dwellers simply dumped them onto the street, adding another layer to the unsavory cocktail of smells and hazards. What makes these early laws fascinating is how they reveal medieval priorities. Cleanliness was tied to health, morality, and social order. A dirty street was not just unpleasant, it was considered a sign of disorder and decay. The idea was that filth could invite divine punishment, or worse, disease. It's a belief that echoes through centuries and cultures, the fear that filth attracts evil, sickness, or misfortune. Yet the laws were inconsistently applied. Nobles and merchants could often avoid penalties, while the poor, who lived packed into the most cramped and filthy quarters, bore the brunt. Enforcement was patchy and often depended on local officials' whims or corruption. Sometimes the presence of dog droppings was overlooked as a necessary evil in the city's messy ecosystem. This uneven application highlights a broader theme in medieval urban life: the clash between ideals and realities. City authorities aspired to order and cleanliness but struggled against the limitations of infrastructure, culture, and sheer population density. It's a tension historians still debate. Were these laws sincere public health measures or superficial attempts at appearing civilized? Meanwhile, the persistent problem led to the rise of a curious profession: dog dung collectors. As the laws piled on, so did the need for people willing to get their hands dirty cleaning the streets. But before we get there, it's worth noting that early ordinances not only targeted dog owners but also the dogs themselves. Some cities tried controlling dog populations by banning strays or limiting the number of dogs a person could own. Paris experimented with similar ideas, but dogs were too embedded in daily life for such restrictions to be fully successful. In fact, the city's approach to dog poop laws was an early example of urban regulation grappling with modern public health challenges. The concept that the cleanliness of public spaces impacted the well being of all citizens was novel and crucial. This awareness, even if imperfectly implemented, laid the groundwork for later sanitation reforms that would reshape cities centuries later. So, as you continue through the grimy streets, remember, beneath all the filth and frustration was a city trying, sometimes clumsily, often ineffectively, to take control of its own mess. Those early laws, however flawed, represent the first legal footsteps toward a cleaner, healthier urban life. And yes, the idea of tying a bell to your dog to warn of incoming poop, that's the kind of detail that makes you wonder what other odd regulations were lurking in dusty medieval scrolls waiting to surprise us. As you keep walking, your ears catch the low barks and occasional yips echoing through narrow alleys. The dogs of medieval Paris are everywhere, some trotting proudly alongside nobles, others rummaging through refuse piles, and a few curled up in doorways trying to stay warm. These four-legged residents weren't just a uniform group, they came in many shapes and social standings, much like their human neighbors. First up, the hunting hounds. These were the prized dogs of the aristocracy, bred and trained for chasing game and accompanying their masters on hunting expeditions. Think sleek, muscular animals with keen noses and sharp eyes, adorned with collars of leather or metal. These dogs lived a life of luxury compared to the city's street mutts, often housed inside grand estates and fed scraps from lavish kitchens. Yet when they accompanied their masters into the city, they were free to roam and naturally left their droppings wherever they pleased. After all, no noble would be seen stooping to clean up after a royal hound. Then there were the alley curs, the scruffy street dogs you spot weaving in and out of the legs of market sellers and city dwellers. These dogs had no owners, surviving off scraps, garbage, and the occasional kind handout. Their fur was patchy and their demeanors wary, sometimes scavengers, sometimes pests. These dogs were seen as part of the urban backdrop, ignored or shooed away but rarely cared for. Their poop, of course, contributed significantly to the street filth. In contrast, lapdogs were a peculiar phenomenon. Beloved mostly by noble women and wealthy townsfolk, these tiny dogs were more fashion accessory than functional animal. Often carried in ornate baskets or cradled in arms, they were pampered to the extreme. Despite their diminutive size, they too left messes behind, usually in the homes or courtyards of the elite. Far from the crowded streets, lapdogs' droppings might have been smaller, but the expectation was that their owners would manage the mess discreetly. An amusing fringe tidbit: some lapdogs were reportedly trained to use small, velvet covered doggy toilets indoors, complete with chamber pots just for them. Whether that's a true medieval fact or a bit of romanticized legend is up for debate, but it's a vivid image of the lengths nobles went to avoid unpleasantness. Now, as you can imagine, the mix of these canine classes caused quite a mess, not just physically but socially. The noble hunting dogs' messes were mostly ignored or cleaned by servants, while the alley dog's droppings became part of the city's collective headache. Parisians often blamed the strays for the worst of the filth, leading to a long-standing tension between residents and free-roaming animals. Historians still argue whether the city's efforts to control stray dog populations through culling or restrictions made a significant dent in the problem or just moved it around. Some records suggest periodic mass killings of strays, while others hint that many dogs simply adapted, growing wiser to human attempts at control. Interestingly, the dogs themselves shaped the urban environment. Their scavenging habits kept some refuse under control, eating scraps that might otherwise rot in the streets. But the cost was high: more poop, more smell, and more complaints. In this canine ecosystem, you can see the interplay between humans and animals in the city's development. Dogs were indispensable companions and helpers, yet their mess created a serious problem nobody quite knew how to manage. This duality reflects the larger urban challenges of medieval Paris, where the benefits of city life came tangled with its many messes. So, as you imagine yourself stepping lightly past a noble's hunting dog, sidestepping a pack of street mutts, and glimpsing a pampered lapdog in a lady's arms, remember that each contributed in their own way to the city's growing need for order and for people willing to clean up the inevitable consequences. The dogs of Paris were more than just pets. They were key players in the city's daily life, and unfortunately its sanitation nightmare. You step carefully now, because the ground beneath you isn't just stone and dirt. It's a chaotic mix of muck, dried animal droppings, human waste, and every sticky, squishy thing you can imagine. The streets of medieval Paris were not paved like modern roads. Many were just compacted dirt, cobblestones tossed down in patches or wooden planks in some places. The result: when it rained, the mess turned into a wet, slimy soup that sloshed with every step you took. Water drainage was primitive at best. Some main streets had open gutters along the sides to carry away liquid waste, but these gutters were often clogged with debris, turning into stagnant, smelly canals. The city's famous River Seine provided a tempting outlet, but tossing waste directly into it was dangerous and frowned upon, although not always avoided. Historians still argue whether the city's early sewer systems were enough to prevent widespread contamination or if they merely delayed an inevitable public health crisis. Imagine the market squares, once lively places of trade and social gathering, turned into sticky quagmires by midday, as people, animals, and carts churned the muck underfoot. Horses left hoof prints filled with manure. Pigs, chickens, and dogs contributed their own layers, making every step a gamble. It's no wonder medieval texts sometimes describe Parisian streets as rivers of filth. Then there was the issue of timing. Waste accumulated throughout the day and night. Some waste workers tried to sweep or clean, but many streets were impossible to maintain with the tools available. At night, some waste collectors, sometimes called night soilmen, would come through to shovel the worst messes, but their work was never enough to keep pace with the city's output of excrement. Adding to the chaos, chamber pots were emptied out of upper story windows directly onto the street below. Imagine walking under a window and suddenly getting hit by a splash of someone else's breakfast or worse. This window shower was so common that pedestrians developed a wary practice of constantly looking up, especially in narrow alleys where the risk was higher. And here's a quirky, less known fact. Some Parisians carried long sticks with hooks called nettoyeurs to poke or push piles of dung out of their way without touching them. The idea was to navigate the streets like a dangerous obstacle course, avoiding hazards without losing your shoes or your stomach. This daily slog through muck wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The streets were breeding grounds for fleas, rats, and other vermin, all of which contributed to spreading diseases like the plague. Many medieval citizens believed the foul smells themselves could carry illness, an idea called miasma theory, which guided public health practices for centuries. Despite all this, the city's infrastructure was slow to improve. Cobblestones might be laid in wealthier districts, but poorer neighborhoods remained muddy pits. Drainage ditches clogged quickly with the sheer volume of waste. Cleaning efforts were often overwhelmed by the sheer amount of material to be dealt with. You can almost hear the groans of the horses and carts stuck in the muck, the shouts of vendors slipping and falling, and the curses of citizens trying to keep their feet clean. It was a relentless, squishy slog, and the only real relief came from those who were willing to get their hands dirty to clear the streets. In this slimy soup of Parisian life, the dog droppings you noticed earlier were just one ingredient in a larger stew of urban waste. Each added layer complicated the city's fight for cleanliness and order. You start to understand that the streets were not just a public thoroughfare, they were a living, breathing mess of waste, movement, and survival. The city's struggle with its filth was a daily challenge that shaped everything from health to social relations. So, as you trudge on, watch your step, because the streets beneath you hold centuries of smelly, squishy stories, all waiting to be uncovered. You might think that with all this mess, the city would have one clear team to handle it. Cleaners with brooms, shovels, and buckets, marching through the streets on a noble mission. But nope, medieval Paris was way too complicated for that. Instead, there were multiple groups, each with slightly different jobs, and Parisians themselves often couldn't keep track of who did what. The confusion between dog dung collectors, street sweepers, and Night Soil Man was a comedy of errors, or at least a tangled mess of duties. First, the dog dung collectors, often called ramasseurs de crotte, were specialized laborers who focused primarily on scooping up dog poop from public streets and alleys. Their job was both necessary and gross, and their social status reflected that. You wouldn't invite a poop collector to a fancy dinner, but without them, the streets would have been unbearable. These workers usually operated during the day, roaming neighborhoods with their tools, sticks, scoops, or rakes, collecting the piles of dog droppings that constantly accumulated. Street sweepers, on the other hand, had a broader remit. They were responsible for clearing away general debris, straw, mud, garbage, and sometimes animal droppings too. Their tools were brooms made from twigs or straw bundles. They worked mostly on main thoroughfares or market squares, where cleanliness was more visible and demanded by the city's wealthier citizens. Street sweepers often worked at dawn to clear the overnight mess before the city truly woke up. And then there were the night soil men. Their title sounds poetic, but their work was not. These laborers cleaned human waste, emptying chamber pots and latrines, usually under cover of darkness. It was a dirty, smelly, and often dangerous job, but crucial for preventing the city from drowning in its own filth. Night soil men transported human waste to designated dumps or cesspits, sometimes even outside city limits. They were feared and avoided by most, but also strangely respected for their indispensable service. Parisians often mixed these roles up, complaining about the street cleaners, regardless of who exactly was responsible for which filth. This confusion sometimes led to frustration with authorities who failed to enforce proper cleaning or pay these workers adequately. The poop collectors were often scapegoated for not cleaning everything, even though their job was very specific. A fun, somewhat odd tidbit is that some dog dung collectors carried bells or whistles to announce their presence, giving wary citizens a chance to avoid them or warn children to keep away. It created a kind of poop collector soundtrack, echoing through the alleys. Imagine the bells ringing alongside the rattle of carts and the shouts of merchants. Historians still argue whether these roles overlapped enough to confuse enforcement and payment, or if the division of labor was fairly clear to medieval Parisians themselves. Some sources suggest these workers were organized into guilds or groups that regulated their own trades, while others imply a more chaotic patchwork system. Despite their differences, these workers shared one thing: social invisibility. Their labor was crucial, yet they lived on the edges of society, stigmatized and often ignored. Their profession was seen as dirty work, necessary but not honorable. Yet, without their efforts, the city would have been unlivable. So, as you imagine the streets ringing with bells, brooms sweeping mud, and shovels scraping piles of poop, remember, medieval Paris had more than one kind of cleaner, and the city's battle against filth was fought on many fronts with many players. The overlap and confusion in duties paint a picture of a city struggling to organize itself amid chaos. It's a messy story, literally and figuratively. By now, you're beginning to see how medieval Paris was less a city and more a fragrant, squelching ecosystem where smells battled for supremacy. But beyond the mess and the muck, the authorities tried to impose some order, a set of rules, laws, and social expectations aimed at taming the chaos, even if often ignored or sidestepped. City orders, or ordonnances, were issued by Parisian officials trying to regulate everything from waste disposal to market cleanliness. Some laws demanded that dog owners be responsible for cleaning up after their animals and required that streets be kept free of filth. Other edicts banned dumping waste in public spaces or ordering that chamber pots be emptied only in designated places. But enforcement was notoriously lax. You can imagine how hard it was to control a city without modern policing or sanitation infrastructure. These laws often felt like suggestions ignored by most who found daily life too hectic or too unpleasant to bother. Nobles, merchants, and peasants alike flouted the rules when it suited them. Social shame also played a role. Filthy streets and public messes weren't just unpleasant, they were seen as moral failings, reflecting on the community's decency. Yet, paradoxically, those who worked to clean up the mess were often marginalized or stigmatized, caught in a social paradox of being needed but despised. A quirky little detail: some city orders prescribed symbolic punishments for leaving dog poop in the streets, like forcing offenders to wear signs or carry their own waste in public as a form of humiliation. Imagine that for a moment, the medieval version of public shaming before the internet made it a global pastime. Historians still argue whether these ordinances actually improved urban hygiene or merely shifted the problem around. Did people clean more because of the laws, or did they find clever ways to avoid penalties? Some scholars believe that the laws were more about projecting an image of control and civility than about real cleanliness. There is also the question of who the laws really served. Often, regulations targeted poorer residents or marginalized groups, while wealthier citizens enjoyed exemptions or simply ignored the rules with impunity. This created tensions in the city, with poorer neighborhoods becoming dumping grounds for the wealthy's refuse. You can hear the quiet irony in the city's attempts, a grand medieval bureaucracy trying to police a chaos that was both physical and social. The laws were, in many ways, a dance around a problem that had no easy fix. As you wander these ordered yet disorderly streets in your mind, you notice that the city scent is layered not only with dog poop and garbage, but with frustration, resignation, and the persistent human hope that somehow order can emerge from the stink. So, the next time you think of laws and rules, remember medieval Paris's dog poop ordinances, a mix of genuine concern, social control, and the eternal human struggle against messiness, both in the world and in ourselves. You might wonder, if the city had laws demanding cleanliness, why didn't everyone just pick up after themselves? Why no gloves, no little plastic bags, no scoops passed out on every corner like today? Well, the medieval mindset and technology simply weren't there yet. Clean was a very relative term, shaped more by social customs and available tools than by any shared standard. Imagine walking through the city streets with bare hands, no rubber gloves, and maybe just a ragged cloth to wipe your fingers if you dared to touch something unpleasant. The idea of picking up dog poop was considered not only unpleasant but frankly beneath most people's dignity. The job was left to the lower classes, those who lived and worked on society's edges. Medieval tools for cleaning were crude and often ineffective. The most common were sticks with hooked ends to prod and push waste aside. Gloves were rare, and when used, usually made from coarse materials that didn't offer much protection. There were no plastic bags or sanitary containers. Waste was collected in wooden buckets or simple carts. This relative clean also reflected how people understood health and hygiene. Baths were infrequent and often public, soap was expensive, and germs were invisible mysteries. Dirt and filth were accepted as part of daily life, tolerated as unavoidable nuisances rather than urgent threats. You probably won't survive long if you imagine medieval hygiene through a modern lens. It's a miracle anyone thrived amid such grime. Here's a quirky detail. Some medieval folk believed that dog dung itself could have medicinal uses, from treating wounds to curing skin ailments. While that sounds gross to you, it reveals how complex and contradictory ideas about cleanliness and dirt could be. Historians still argue whether the medieval approach to hygiene was shaped more by ignorance or by a different cultural logic altogether. Was filth just a fact of life, or did people genuinely try to manage it with the means they had? The answer is probably somewhere in between. You start to realize that medieval cleanliness was not a simple clean versus dirty dichotomy, but a spectrum influenced by social status, available resources, and cultural beliefs. The dog poop on the streets wasn't just waste, it was part of a broader system of how people lived with dirt, smell, and disorder. So, as you imagine yourself navigating these streets barefoot if you must, remember that medieval Paris was a world where clean was something you hoped for but rarely achieved, and where the idea of personally scooping dog poop was an absurd luxury. You're probably thinking that all this dog poop just disappeared into the ether, but actually, it had a surprisingly valuable second life. In medieval Paris, dog waste was more than just a stinky problem. It was almost a little treasure waiting to be harvested. Almost because turning poop into gold wasn't exactly easy or glamorous, but it did happen. Dog dung found a crucial role in the tanning industry, which was a major part of Paris's economy. Tanners used animal waste as part of the process to soften and prepare leather. The enzymes and ammonia in the poop helped break down animal hides, making them more pliable for crafting shoes, belts, and other goods. It was a gritty, smelly, and somewhat toxic business, but necessary for making the leather that kept the city's shoes on feet. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some records hint that dog droppings were mixed with human waste or even pigeon droppings to create stronger tanning agents. The exact recipes are lost to time, but the idea that dog poop contributed to the leather shoes you might have worn is oddly satisfying and a little gross. Historians still argue whether dog waste was more prized for its chemical properties or simply collected because it was abundant and easy to gather. Some think that human waste was preferred but harder to collect, so dog poop filled the gaps. But the story doesn't end there. Beyond tanning, dog waste was sometimes used as fertilizer. Medieval gardeners, facing limited resources, valued the nitrogen-rich properties of manure from all sorts of animals, including dogs. You wouldn't find this in glossy garden catalogs today, but it was practical back then. Of course, using dog poop in leather or fields brought its own problems. The smell was unbearable near tanneries and gardens, and the risk of spreading disease was real. That's why tanneries were often located at the edges of the city, downwind and downhill from residential areas, because nobody wanted their shoes or cabbages to come with a side of stench. So, as you imagine this city of poop, not just as a place of mess, but as an ecosystem where waste had value, you begin to see medieval Paris as a surprisingly resourceful place. What we call trash, they called materials. This idea that waste could become wealth is a strange but important piece of the story. Dog poop wasn't just a problem, it was part of the city's economy, cycling through invisible channels from street to workshop to field. Keep this in mind next time you step around a pile of dog poop. Someone centuries ago might have been counting on it to make their livelihood. Follow the trail now, and you find yourself at the stinking edge of medieval Paris, where tanneries, infamous for their putrid smells, lined the riverbanks. These tanneries were the grim final destination for much of the city's dog poop and other waste, a place where filth turned into something useful but at a terrible olfactory cost. Walking near these workshops, you'd be hit with an assault on the senses. The thick stench of rotting hides mixed with fermenting manure and chemical fumes from the tanning process. This was no place for the faint of heart or nose. The air might be so foul that nearby residents often tried to keep windows shut tight or avoid the area altogether. Tanneries were usually situated downwind and outside the city's main quarters, partly because their smell was unbearable and partly to protect the rest of the city from contamination. Waste, including dog dung, arrived by cart or riverboat, piled high to be used in the laborious process of turning raw skins into soft, usable leather. Interestingly, tanneries also represented a social and economic paradox. While the jobs were dirty and workers low status, the leather industry was vital to urban life. Shoes, belts, harnesses, and gloves were necessities. Tanneries brought in income and employment, but at a cost that no one wanted in their backyard. The proximity to the Seine River was a blessing and a curse. The river provided water essential for rinsing hides and washing away residues, but it also became a conduit for pollution, with waste seeping into the waterway. Historians still argue how much damage this caused to public health and the environment, but there is little doubt the river was far from pristine. A quirky note here. Some records describe the tanner's plague, a mysterious illness believed to afflict workers exposed to chemicals and waste, though the exact causes remain debated. Some say it was poisoning from tannin fumes. Others suspect bacterial infections from contact with animal and human waste. So, as you picture yourself at the boundary between medieval Paris and its outskirts, you're standing at a crossroads of economy and ecology, where the city's mess was processed, transformed, and then, hopefully, contained. It's a vivid reminder that even centuries ago, waste management was as much about geography and social divisions as it was about cleaning up. The city's poop might have seemed like a hopeless problem, but it was also part of a bigger, stinkier story about survival, adaptation, and the price people paid for urban life. Now, as you breathe in that lingering stench from the tanneries, your mind drifts to something darker: plague, piety, and poop. Three forces that shaped medieval Paris's attitudes toward cleanliness in ways both practical and deeply spiritual. The Black Death and other plagues swept through Paris multiple times, and while today we know germs spread disease, back then people linked filth and illness with divine punishment. Dirty streets, foul smells, and especially piles of waste weren't just nuisances. They were seen as signs of moral failure and sin. The phrase miasma, bad air, was the go-to explanation for why sickness struck. So stench literally felt deadly. This belief gave the city's authorities and clergy a double duty: to keep Paris physically clean and morally pure. Religious festivals often included cleansing rituals, and church leaders preached that maintaining order and cleanliness was part of obeying God's will. Dirt wasn't just dirt, it was spiritual decay. A fringe idea from some sources suggests that certain waste workers were even seen as performing a kind of unholy labor, cursed to touch the city's filth while others prayed for salvation. This mix of reverence and revulsion made sanitation work a peculiar intersection of necessity and social taboo. Historians still argue whether these religious beliefs genuinely improved public health or merely added layers of fear and shame without practical effect? Did seeing filth as sinful lead to better city hygiene, or did it just stigmatize the poor and waste workers more? The answer remains murky. Interestingly, the church sometimes took direct action, funding or organizing cleanup efforts around major holy days or in response to outbreaks. Monasteries often had better sanitation practices than the city, acting as small islands of order in a sea of chaos. You can imagine medieval Parisians tramping through the muck, praying as they went, hoping their faith would protect them from disease, even if the streets did not. So, in this tangle of poop, plague, and piety, you see how medieval Parisians' fears and faith mingled with everyday life. The city's smell wasn't just a nuisance, it was a messenger, a warning, and a challenge to both rulers and residents. As you drift through this thought, remember, cleanliness was never just about hygiene, but about survival, spirituality, and the social fabric that held this noisy, smelly city together. In this tangled mess of streets, smells, and superstitions, dogs often found themselves cast as convenient scapegoats. Stray animals, especially dogs, were blamed for much more than just leaving piles of poop in the street. They became symbols of urban disorder and all that was wrong with the city. You see, dogs were everywhere in medieval Paris. Some were loyal companions to nobles, some prowled as scavengers in the alleys, and others lived rough, surviving off scraps and garbage. But regardless of their status, they were easy targets for blame whenever the city faced problems, whether it was filth, fire, or even famine. Official proclamations sometimes singled out stray dogs as threats to public health and safety. They were accused of spreading disease, which wasn't entirely wrong, of biting citizens, and even of being agents of chaos during times of unrest. This resulted in periodic cults or attempts to banish strays from the city. A quirky historical note: in some areas, dogs were blamed for starting fires simply because they roamed near candles or hearths, leading to frantic hunts for fire dogs after urban blazes. While it sounds like blaming the dog for the kitchen fire today, it shows how desperate people were to find simple explanations for complex disasters. Historians still argue how much of this scapegoating was justified and how much was a way to channel public frustration away from deeper systemic issues like poverty or poor governance. Was blaming dogs a genuine public safety concern or just a social pressure valve? Interestingly, dog owners sometimes faced fines for letting their pets roam freely, but enforcement was spotty. The social divide between well-kept lapdogs and street dogs mirrored broader class tensions. Dogs, like their owners, weren't all treated equally. This scapegoating extended beyond dogs to other animals too. But dogs, with their messy habits and proximity to humans, took much of the blame for the city's dirt and dangers. So the next time you see a city dog happily trotting along, remember that centuries ago they carried not just fleas but the weight of a city's anxieties, unfairly bearing blame for problems far beyond their control. As the city bustled and stank, the people who actually did the dirty work, collecting waste, cleaning streets, and hauling night soil, occupied a peculiar social niche. They were absolutely essential, yet they lived on the margins, invisibly shuffling through the filth while the rest of Paris turned away. These waste workers were part of the lowest social classes, often immigrants, former prisoners, or those with few other job options. Their work was seen as shameful and unclean, making it hard for them to gain respect or acceptance. But without them, the city would have been overwhelmed by filth. Despite the disgust, Many of these workers took pride in their role. They developed tight knit communities and unwritten codes for their labor. Their knowledge of the city's hidden corners and refuse routes made them indispensable, even if they were rarely praised. There was also a complex dance of visibility and invisibility. Waste workers had to be seen enough to do their jobs, but invisible enough to avoid social scorn. They worked mostly at night or early morning to avoid crowds, slipping through alleys and under the noses of disdainful citizens. A quirky note. Some waste workers adopted nicknames based on their profession, like the muckman or night shifter, turning what others saw as humiliation into a form of identity and even camaraderie. Historians still argue how these workers navigated their paradoxical status. Did their essential role give them some social power, or were they forever trapped in invisibility and stigma? The truth likely varied from person to person and place to place. The city's attitudes towards them also reflected broader anxieties about cleanliness, purity, and social order. The jobs were vital but often assigned to the untouchables of medieval society. So, as you imagine those quiet figures moving through the dawn streets, buckets in hand, you see a world where filth was not just physical but deeply social, where the line between clean and dirty was drawn not just on the pavement but in people's minds. You've been wandering through the messy streets and stinky corners of medieval Paris. But the city's sanitation story isn't just about muck and manpower. It's also soaked in corruption, bribes, and power struggles. Clean streets, it turns out, were as much a political battleground as a practical concern. City officials who oversaw waste removal and street cleaning often had to balance public demand with limited resources. Contracts for cleaning were frequently auctioned off to the highest bidder, which sometimes meant that the job went to whoever paid the best bribe or promised the quickest payoff, rather than the most competent or honest workers. This created a web of rivalries among sanitation contractors, dog dung collectors, and even city guards who might turn a blind eye to overflowing waste in exchange for a little extra coin. Citizens grumbled about the smells and hazards, but their complaints often bounced off bureaucratic walls soaked in self interest. A fringe detail. Some street sweepers were known to hide piles of waste to make their routes look cleaner during inspections, only to dump the mess back onto the streets after officials left. These little acts of sabotage reveal just how patchy and unreliable medieval sanitation really was. Historians still argue how deeply corruption affected the overall cleanliness of Paris. Was it a matter of rotten officials causing the stench, or were the problems simply too big and complex for any honest effort to fix? The debate continues. Interestingly, sanitation disputes occasionally sparked public protests or petitions, showing that even in a world drowning in filth, citizens demanded better conditions and accountability. So, beneath the grime and the dog poop, you find a layer of human ambition and greed shaping the city's fate. The battle over waste was not just a fight against smell, but a struggle for control, profit, and influence in one of Europe's busiest medieval cities. This murky politics of poop reminds us that sometimes the stinkiest problems aren't just about dirt, they're about who holds the power to clean it up. By now, you've tramped through the streets, sniffed the tanneries, and met the dog poop collectors. But the story of medieval Paris's sanitation ends on a slow, grudging note. The slow march towards sanitation modernization, just barely. As Paris grew wealthier and more crowded, the stink became harder to ignore. Rulers started to pass more laws, ordering cleaner streets and stricter waste removal, but enforcement lagged far behind the promises. Old habits died hard, and the profession of poop scoopers lingered stubbornly into the early modern period. Cobblestones replaced dirt alleys, and rudimentary sewer systems began to take shape, carrying some waste away from the surface. But the networks were patchy, incomplete, and often overwhelmed by the city's size. Parisians still had to dodge dog dung and chamber pots, sometimes with new complaints about sewer gases and floods. The role of poop collectors slowly shifted or disappeared as public services improved, but the profession left its mark in the city's lore and language. The chiffoniers or rag pickers who followed in the wake of cleaners carried on some of the dirty work, recycling and scavenging what others discarded. Historians still argue whether these gradual improvements resulted mainly from technological advances, economic pressure, or changing social attitudes toward cleanliness and public health. Was it inevitable progress, or did a few determined reformers push the city forward? What's clear is that the fight against filth was a long, slow battle. Even by the 18th century, Parisian streets were far from spotless, and the old tension between city order and human messiness remained. As you picture the city's cobblestone streets beginning to shine a little more under gaslight, remember how much effort and grit it took just to keep dog poop from choking the city. Medieval Paris's sanitation story isn't a neat success. It's a messy, stinky testament to human persistence and the unending struggle for a cleaner life. So now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, let the thought linger. Every spotless street you walk today once bore the weight of centuries of dog poop, politics, and perseverance. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy and the bustling, stinky streets of medieval Paris begin to fade, imagine the city settling into quiet. The noisy clatter of carts and barking dogs softens into a gentle hum, like the distant echo of a world learning slowly, stubbornly to clean itself. Feel the cool night air brushing against your skin, carrying away the smells that once overwhelmed the senses. The river Seine glides calmly beneath moonlight, reflecting the flicker of lamps from streets that, though imperfect, pulse with the lives of millions. You're wrapped in the comfort of knowing that even in the messiest moments of history, there was hope, progress, and the tireless effort of countless unseen people. The dog poop collectors, the tanners, the sweepers, they were not just dealing with filth, but with the complex challenge of city life itself. Let your breathing slow, syncing with the rhythm of a city learning to breathe cleaner air, step by slow step. Remember, every clean street today has a story soaked in patience, resilience, and the stubborn determination to make life just a little better. Now drift gently into sleep with the image of Paris, noisy, smelly, chaotic, but alive, transforming through centuries of human endeavor. Sweet dreams.